your Washington Chapter President, and on behalf of the Washington Chapter Board, I'd like to welcome you all, panelists and participants, to this first virtual Reopening Schools Roundtable. Washington State has we have exactly 295 districts all grappling with how to open schools this fall. And across the state, it's going to look different. Some school districts with low to zero COVID cases are going to open fully, others partially open. And so we really need to stay connected as districts and communities for the safety and well-being of our students. We know the value of our teachers. Face-to-face learning is a priority, and peer-to-peer learning as well. And OSPI has issued guidelines that will help districts reopen, but really, what does it mean? The pandemic has also exacerbated disparities and inequities across the state in our educational system. This statewide conversation hopes to solicit and gather information and solutions that could be put into a document and shared back with OSPI. The solutions we're looking for need to be equitable, sustainable, affordable, and doable. We have prepared questions for our panelists, and after the panelists have had a chance to discuss amongst themselves, we'll open it up to breakout sessions where you, the participants, will be able to share back as well. And as you come up with solutions that possibly we haven't heard about yet, then please share those out. I do want to mention that the panelists are representative of their fields, but they, especially the school districts, do not speak for their organizations. We are really all seeking answers. I also want to let you know that Dr. Campbell is not able to join us today, and she sends her regrets. Earlier, she has been part of the task force with OSPI. So in a sense, she has already joined us today. So thank you for all her efforts to this point. And earlier when we had a conversation with her, she had these words to share. We are all living within the question right now. This is an opportunity for us to align our questions as the answers are right in front of us. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Benjamin Field, our A4LE Chapter President for next year, and he's going to lead introductions and the roundtable. So thank you again for participating.
Thanks, Tane. I am, of course, having some technical difficulties because why wouldn't I? Let me see if I can reshare our presentation this afternoon. All right. So I am excited to welcome you all to our roundtable on discussing what reopening schools in Washington State after COVID may look like for us. I'm going to get some quick things out of the way. Let me see if this can speed things up. I apologize for this. Everything had been working until we actually launched. Let's see. There we go. Looks like it's coming back. So we have a quick agenda. We're through the welcome. So that's 1/6 of the way there, I guess. We have introductions on the subject matter from Steve Murakami, who's joining us. He'll talk about OSPI. Nancy Bernard will talk about the Department of Health and their recommendations a little bit. And then Joanne Wilcox will share a little bit of AIA's Nationals recommendations. From there, we're going to move on to a panel discussion, have a few questions for our panelists to talk about. And then we're going to go into a small group discussion where we're going to break everybody out into rooms of about 9 people each. And then while you guys are talking about what you want to talk about, we're going to ask you to record your thoughts and then share those back to the main group after you come back, and then we'll wrap up. So we should be wrapping up right around 5 today. There is AIA credit available for this meeting, so we have to put the learning objectives in so everybody knows what they're supposed to learn and can decide whether they learned it or not at the end. Let me see, there we go. So I'm hoping that everyone was able to log on to Mentimeter. Let me see if I can get this to open up real quick. We're going to try and find out who is joining us and what segments of the profession they are in. All right, there we go. Let me open voting. So if you were able to log on to Mentimeter through your phone, you can start to respond. We'll give a couple of seconds here for everybody to log in. The instructions are on the top of the screen if you missed it on the splash page. All right. Whoa, there are a lot of architects here. I feel like I should be calling this like a horse race. Give it a few more seconds to register everyone, and then we're going to jump on to the next question. All right. That's still bouncing around a little bit, but I think that we can see that we've got a good representation from school districts, a lot of architects, good amount of engineers, and then we have some project managers and some construction individuals. Be interested. I should have had a way to tell me what other was. All right, let's move on. See if I can get this to go to the next slide without too much difficulty. Here we go. So I'm going to ask you what county you work in, so be prepared. It's a very difficult question. Let's see. So it looks like the vast majority is in either phase 1 or phase 2 of reopening their counties. All right. Now, I'm going to ask Steve to talk a little bit about OSPI and their current recommendations on the continuum of options for school reopening.
All right, thanks, Ben. Quick introduction. My name is Steve Murakami. I got to serve on the facilities subcommittee for the reopening task force. And so I'm going to be going over some highlights. I should say I'm your A4LE Washington governor. I'm also the Pacific Northwest director on the International Board of Directors for A4LE. And so I'm representing the organization. I'm also on TAC, and OAC Services keeps me employed day to day, working for Lake Washington, Mukilteo, North Shore, and Monroe school districts. So a little background on me. As you can see on the screen, the first conversation for the task force was really identifying the modalities of teaching. And so they identified 7 different opportunities in which we can instruct students. And you can see that 1, 2, 4, and 6 are grayed out. And that's because those are traditional models that are already being employed by school districts to teach. And so they didn't have to reinforce any of that. That's within the wheelhouse. That's within the old normal. So they really focused on 3, 5, and then again 7. And so as Superintendent Rakedahl issued several different points of guidance and the guide itself, you know, he really reinforced prioritizing districts to get back to face-to-face learning. And there's some caveats there. That's face-to-face learning as the public health agencies allow. And so we have Nancy Bernard here, and she'll talk about some of the strategies around really mitigating and protecting and curbing the transmission. But a lot of it, including all of these 3, 5, and 7, they're all prefaced with the fact that we will be going back to school face-to-face, but we still have to do physical distancing and we have to wear face masks. And so when this document came out, if you've read it, you probably still have a lot of unanswered questions. This puts a lot of questions out there, but doesn't give a lot of answers because so many districts have such unique situations, and we're all going to be in various states of having the directive lifted. And so the challenge is going to be for at least, you know, the major, the counties of King, Pierce, and Snohomish, where we have something like 600,000 students of the million plus that are in the state of Washington. I think just under 60% of all students in Washington are in those 3 counties. And we still have some pretty high rates. And so if you're in a smaller district, I imagine you guys getting back to the old normal a lot faster than us, but you're still going to have to deal with distancing, and you're still going to have to deal with masks. And so when you start thinking about distancing in your classroom, on your buses, there are some major issues to think about. Capacity is going to be reduced, which is going to drive everything. So classroom capacity and transportation are 2 huge barriers that we're all going to have to think creatively around on how to get kids to school. And once we get them there, how do we group them and teach them in a way that we avoid large groups and can keep them separated and safe. And so the first model, split or rotating schedules, this was really looking at trying to figure out how to get all kids back to school for some FaceTime during the week. And that either you could be, you know, kids with last names A through L could be Monday, Wednesday, M through Z could be Tuesday, Thursday, or you could do it on a weekly basis and rotate around. And that way students will get FaceTime with their teachers. We noted, you know, that we were pretty fortunate to have half a year under our belt when we had to go home and go into distance learning, because teachers had that opportunity to get to really know their students. And, you know, educators today are so focused on trying to personalize the educational path for every student that learning what works for each child is critical. And so now when we're going into a new school year and teachers are with new students, it's going to be really interesting to see how to do the assessments and identify what's going to work for these students. And so that's why we're trying to prioritize FaceTime and getting actual person-to-person contact. And so this split or rotating schedule would have students at all grade levels coming back in a couple of days a week, with the teacher having remote sessions every day, and probably that 5th day for either professional development or outreach to those kids who need it most. One item to note with the split or rotating schedule was an intention behind looking at keeping all kids from individual families going back to school on the same days, so that parents at least had a couple of days that they could rely on to get back into their work environment. The next one, phased in opening. This one's a little more loose. This one's a little interesting to try and figure out. This is thinking that primary grade level kids are going to be the hardest to get good educational growth in a remote learning environment. And so what this is looking at is saying, okay, primary kids, we're going to bring you back and we're going to put you in elementary, middle, and high schools. And we're going to spread you out and we're going to have tons of space for you to teach you appropriately and distanced. And secondary kids, middle school, high school, who are more comfortable with our new norm, the Zoom meetings, the Teams instruction, all of that will be phased in as the ban is lifted. And so both 3 and 5 lean on continuous learning 2.0. And so continuous learning 2.0 is really the state of which we ended the school year in. And the 2.0 version is really trying to take it a step further. It's to connect to our educational partners. It's to bring in more support and scaffold the process around each student. It's to be able to get in and do the assessments, to understand every situation that the student is coming from, figure out what their learning model specific to them is going to be. And then there's additional supports for our English language learners, our students of color, our special education students. It's really trying to get into all aspects of our daily instruction that we would normally have in a face-to-face environment, but leveraging it and thinking critically and then morally and ethically responding to what we find out in those assessments to make sure that we're truly supporting each of the students, and that the students farthest from the educational justice are supported in the right way. So with that, I will turn it back to Ben.
Thank you, Steve. We got one more quick survey. Let me see if this works. Do you know what phase your school district is planning to open? So it should come up in the next few seconds. And we'll take a little bit of time for everybody to answer.
Hey, Ben, in the meantime, while they're doing that, there was a question from Ariel in the chat window about districts considering keeping students with their current teachers next year and having teachers elevate grades. I haven't heard of any conversations specific to that. I would think that if you're moving around within your elementary or your middle or your high, that could be a possibility. But as kids transition between elementary, middle, and middle to high, not likely. But I haven't heard that specifically being addressed. So if anybody else, strict architects, anybody that's involved in this, if you have something different or something else, I'd love to see it in the group chat. While we're waiting for the new survey to load, I had mentioned that I thought in the conversations I've had to date, the things that I haven't been able to get my arm around is how to get kids to school, how to screen them, how to do the queuing. for most elementary schools, at least, you can picture in your mind a covered play with a laminated teacher's name on it, and that those kids line up in a row of 30, and you get them all lined up, and the teacher comes and grabs each row and brings them into school for the day. With the kind of screening that they're talking about doing, and how to triage that if you do have a kid with symptoms, where are you going to put them? Also, just even before they get to school, figuring out how to do transportation is going to be a monumental task. There's going to be a lot of encouraging parents to drive there and drive and drop off. I've heard conversations with districts about pushing out the walking distance border around each school to try and increase it so more kids are walking. I've also heard conversations about trying to get bus drivers being able to screen students before they come on the bus, and that won't work because of their charge to supervise all students on the bus, and that they can't be outside doing the temperature and the symptoms check. And so then having a para or a nurse riding along, and the model gets incredibly complicated trying to figure out how to get all these kids to these sites. Very challenging. And then another thing that I think is one of the main constraints is going to be classroom capacity, and trying to figure out, if you're going to maintain 6 feet, what does that do to the actual capacity of every classroom? And if you haven't seen it, mostly architects on the East Coast have prepared a really nice graphic and breakdown of what social distancing looks like in classrooms and what it does to capacities. And so I'll put a link to that in the chat in just a second. But it graphically shows a triangulated distancing where if you're at 6 feet, you're probably down to about 55% capacity of each classroom. And so that then triggers the whole need for option 3 or 5 or some kind of modified solution. So I'll put a link to that in the chat as we go to the next survey. Ben, are we closer? All right, I don't see Ben on the call anymore. Ben, like most of us, is fighting for bandwidth with young kids in the house and trying to figure out how to stream SpongeBob, Teams meetings, high school students, all of that all at once. And so we'll give him a second to jump back in. Tane, did you have something for the group?
Yeah, I wanted to just mention on the whole transportation piece, even if you say, well, we're increasing the walk zone, which might trigger bike riding. Do schools have bike storage, undercover bike storage, lockable bike storage? So it triggers a whole bunch of other caveats. So, yep.
And if I could piggyback on the transportation piece, hi, I'm Karen from Mukilteo School District. Interestingly, OSPI is saying that Department of Health is not following some of the strict CDC guidance on this issue, and they're not going to require us to ensure 6 feet apart from students on a bus.
Right. What I heard too is that they're just recommending open the windows year round and have all the air in, and siblings sit next to each other, and otherwise try to space yourselves.
Yep.
That's a good point, Karen. For those of you that haven't been involved in a transportation department, I got to have some exposure in Tacoma for a short bit. And, you know, the entire transportation model is based on your elementary school count. That derives the number of buses. And there's always a formula that says, you know, if you have a 56-seater bus, you can probably get 72 kids on there as they squish their little bodies together on those benches. So trying to figure out that 6-foot dimension, in talking with another school district, they did a quick model, and their 50-plus seat bus went down to 16 if you were to actually socially distance. So it's just not possible. I did put a link to that Mostly Architects graphic. They show the various distances with a nice little graphic on how to do a typical classroom layout. And I see Ben is back.
Yeah, I just had my computer crash, so that's super fun. Was Nancy able to
No.
take control?
Nancy, take it away.
Okay. Nancy wasn't told to do it yet.
Oh, all
Can you
right.
can you see my screen?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Well, hello everyone. I have been asked to kind of kick this off with a few minutes of background. Most of you know I work with the Department of Health. I do the School Environmental Health and Safety Program. I will tell you that at this point in time, whether this program continues is up in the air. So hopefully I'll still be here when fall starts to provide technical assistance and resources, but it's a little scary right now with budget cut proposals. So don't forget that guidance keeps evolving and changing. Yes, we have the new OSPI guidance, but that does not mean that certain pieces, particularly Department of Health pieces, may change and be altered over the summer, but it's a good framework in which to start. Don't forget when you're reopening your buildings that you need to flush out your water systems and clean out your buildings. You do not need to disinfect for COVID. It doesn't live that long. This I've been talking about for well over a decade and a half. This is really basic if you don't want to get sick. I think it really sounds familiar now. I'm not going to read slides because we only have a couple minutes. But the basics for not getting sick haven't changed because we have a new virus causing havoc all around the world. So I put together the basics for COVID prevention. Sometimes I got a little frustrated with all this really detailed guidance coming out around COVID. As knowledge of the virus has progressed, knowledge about what we really need to do to stay well has been able to mesh with that. So the basics is stay home when you're sick. This has always been the basic. And schools are going to have to come to grips with this, and so are places of work, because we know that people go to work sick, people go to school sick, and that has to stop with COVID. And on top of this, because this is such a nasty virus, and because there's so much asymptomatic spreading, people that are exposed are expected to stay home for 14 days, which is generally people will become sick within 5 to 7 days, and 14 days is almost the outlier. And that's if you've been over 15 minutes in close contact with somebody who is shedding virus. The other really important thing is hand washing with soap, and then ventilation. Now, these are put in order of importance. Ventilation is being shown to be hugely important. This is primarily respiratory droplet transmission with a piece of aerosol transmission, which means some of it, the virus is floating, and there's some transmission that way. The more dilution ventilation we have, the less transmission we'll have. And therefore, the 6 feet between people, that's my old stay out of spit zones thing I used to talk about. Wearing a cloth face covering is hugely important, and it will become a big part of getting schools and businesses back operating. The least important thing, which has sometimes gotten the biggest attention, is that disinfecting of surfaces. There's very little transmission of this virus from surfaces. They're not saying it doesn't happen or can't happen, but it's not your primary issue. So soap is just really important. And for our schools, it needs to be fragrance-free. It should be dye-free. 30% of people cannot deal with fragrances, and we want them to wash their hands. We do not want antibacterial soaps. I don't have time to go into details. I'm telling schools, if you have any capital budget left over, Think about where we can put in more sinks and how we can upgrade the ventilation system. You can enjoy my T-Rex for a second. Hand washing is important. Hand sanitizers. I know these are going to end up back in the schools. We work really hard to reduce their use. They are not a substitute for hand washing. They're not effective on dirty hands. And you do have to use enough of them that you can actually kill this virus. Fortunately, COVID-19 is caused by lipid envelope virus, which is the easiest types of viruses to kill. This will not kill norovirus. Norovirus is a very hard to kill virus and is still circulating. So when we're relying on hand sanitizer, we need to realize we're not killing noro. So we need more time for real hand washing. And we need to move away from the hand dryers. They just blow everything around, and then you don't have your paper towels for door handles. Schools need to have an infection control plan, and I have information on that. And I'm really recommending people follow this California Healthy Cleaning for Asthma Safer Schools. We have so much asthma in our schools, and custodial and maintenance people have a really high incidence of worker-acquired asthma because of the nature of the cleaners and the disinfectants. And we do not fog. Do not fog, do not mist, do not spray anything. You are not going to kill anything floating in the air. You're just going to cause respiratory illness, asthma, sensitization, and headaches. We need to improve ventilation. There's a lot more information coming out on this. This is an old slide. We've been saying for a while now, the 15 cubic feet per minute per person in the codes in our state since 1991 is minimal. Research from Lawrence Berkeley National Labs and others are saying 20 would be better for health. With COVID, we're saying open those outdoor air supplies, bring in as much outside air as possible. If you've got windows and you can open them, open the windows. That's what they mentioned on the buses, open the windows. The more ventilation you have, the more dilution, the less respiratory droplet transmission. For a number of years, we've been recommending moving up to a MERV 13. Now, ASHRAE this morning on their webinar said 13, 14. And this is a white paper, and there's a program from UC Davis on schools that has some really good guidance on upgrading your HVAC, getting it recommissioned, adjusting your DOAS and outdoor air settings to bring in air 2 hours before the building's occupied, 2 hours after, recirculate as little as possible. Especially from health rooms and bathrooms. And then always, we've said that from science and art. This is a really good resource, and it's in the back for safer cleaners and disinfectants. I've been talking about this for a long time. We really need to move to the alcohol-based and hydrogen peroxide-based disinfectants. They're far safer than the quaternary ammonias and the bleaches, which both cause asthma and trigger asthma. So this is a good guidance that UW did a couple months ago. I helped with it. And then the Responsible Purchasing Network has more details on safer products. If you're going for those wipes, which are going to be coming back, you can get alcohol and peroxide-based fragrance-free wipes. These are other resources that we have available. And don't forget, there is an infectious disease control guide, and the appendix deals with a lot of these issues. And these are the resources. There we go.
Thank you, Nancy. I think Joanne is going to take control and share some information on the AIA National.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ben. My name is Joanne Wilcox. I am a principal at Malum and here representing my role as well for the American Institute of Architects Committee on Education, K-12 co-chair. Had the pleasure, along with several other architects that are actually on the call, I saw some really familiar names, to participate with the American Institute of Architects on their national response to COVID. AIA is uniquely suited to be able to push out on a broad scale the role of architecture as design in order to problem solve some of the conditions that we're living in and moving towards, and as Tane said, the questions that we're living in. And so I just want to briefly introduce you some resources. We're not going to get into depth particular today, but they're available online, and also to announce that there is a schools document that will be released tomorrow. I do have confirmation that it will be uploaded tomorrow. So you can find this information on the AIA's Reopening American Strategies for Safer Buildings. If you roll down to the bottom, you can see not only the reports, this is where tomorrow, it should say a report for strategies for schools, should show up tomorrow with examples. Document strategies for safer buildings, which I'll roll through quickly. They're working in close tandem with CDC and other organizations. So there's also an updated emergency research and public health data. And then the primary three tools that have come out of this, really there's a risk management plan for buildings that as districts and building owners begin to think about reopening can be a resource, and an interactive reoccupancy assessment tool that is being updated, as well as the report to relate directly to schools. And for the architects on the call, there's actually a call to all of us to help the AIA become a public resource and an architecture map for responses that are in effect or how being effective against COVID or with COVID. So really quickly, the first document on that link is the strategies for safer buildings. There's of course some information about the background, et cetera, and the need. But I think what's most interesting about this is really the outcomes. The first tool being a risk management plan. And so moving into that really quickly, which is on this page, you can see and begin to understand then what that looks like. There's also a reoccupancy assessment tool. This is the document that will be updated, that's the right word, with schools in particular. But as you roll down through this, it's available now to help not only architects help our clients and the school districts. There's some information around general conditions, baseline parameters, as well as you can see workplace controls, E for education. As you move down through some of the programming aspects, you can start to see some of those that are particular to schools. Otherwise, if it's not labeled as particular, it would be generic to all building types. You can see from space planning all the way down. So I don't want to dive into a ton of detail here, realizing that we're pretty heavy on the architects. This is a call to help the AIA build this database. The intention is to really create an information framework that projects by state can be searchable by other architects as well as school districts and building owners, and can give information about the project description, what's being done, etc. So on that schools report, because unfortunately it was supposed to be released yesterday, so we were hoping to actually reveal what the report was and was generated. Going to do a really quick overview of the type of content that should be provided. It goes into both district level guidance, thinking about integrated decision making with some information for district checklists, and this really goes to the OSPI report that's there, comments that can be helpful at that level, and then really thinking around building level guidance, and it should pull out some particular cases where either we have opportunities for virus to spread, or perhaps opportunities for prevention of virus spread. And it's going to be divided around things like screening and entry. We're not going to go into a ton of detail, but it should have not only a hazard identified, a risk identified, and several controls that have been generated for each, as well as diagrams. And I'm just going to roll through these so you can see the type of information that's coming, information around health clinic, physical distancing, and here you can see some of those diagrams that Steve was talking about, architects creating opportunities for districts to understand what happens to capacity. You can see perhaps in some of the diagrams, the impact is pretty significant down at the bottom of it. So around capacity, but also student dining, I've already seen some conversations in the chat about how might we begin to address student dining. There is, of course, conversation about students eating in classrooms. This did start to look at capacity. For example, if you take a traditional seating area and switch it over, and then even thinking about through I saw a question about restrooms. So the diagrams and the report should be available tomorrow, and certainly will be included in the information that Tane and Benjamin sent out. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of a taste of the kind of depth of information, and hopefully as a resource that not only the districts but architects can begin to rely on and contribute to. And then it does go a little bit further into reducing surface transmission. As we know, that's not a significant place of infection, but There are also thinking about operating during a pandemic. We've already mentioned it around ventilation and daylight and some of those controls from ASHRAE as well. So I think that's all I wanted to share with regard to what that resource is, and then encourage you to check back tomorrow and to follow the links in order to make a full use of that resource.
Great. Thanks, Joanne. I am going to ask, if you are participating in the meeting and you are not a panelist, could you please stop your video feed? I am going to go ahead and stop mine. And then if you are a panelist, could you take just a quick moment to introduce yourself? And then I will go ahead and ask you the first question.
I'll go. I'm first on the screen. My name is Lisa Johnson. I am an architect and principal at DLR Group in Seattle. I have 20 years of experience in learning environment design.
Thanks, Lisa.
I'll follow that up, Lisa, as the other architect on the panel. I introduced my role for the AIA, but not locally. I'm a principal at Malum Architects, and like Lisa, have been working to design schools for 20 years.
I'll go next. My name is Mohammed Haq. I'm with PAE Consulting Engineers. I've been designing school for over 15 years and been in the local area for just as long.
Do you want to go next, Nancy?
I'm Nancy Bernard. I'm with the School Environmental Health and Safety Program at the Washington State Department of Health.
All right.
And I'm Marina Tanay. I am president of WMOA, which is the Washington Association of Maintenance and Operations Administrators, and a capital projects facilities manager for the Sumner Bonnie Lake School District.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for being here.
Can we adjust these? Wait, there's a comment about mass.
Don't worry about the comments yet, Nancy. We'll get to it.
Okay.
We've got people on it. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, how can schools address and overcome issues of inequity in access to learning as they prepare to reopen? And how can this crisis become a catalyst to ensure every student is given an equal opportunity to succeed in their academic career? I'm going to ask Marina to start that question, and then Nancy, if you could follow up.
Well, thanks, because I feel the least prepared to answer that question. You know, I work in operations and maintenance as well as capital projects. And so, you know, while we certainly work to make our buildings accessible to all, the individual student success piece is something that I'm not very well versed in. I do think that this situation is an opportunity that many districts are taking to take a deep dive in how they deliver education to individual students to meet their needs where they're at, and that this situation forces us to take a closer look at the impact of the situation so that we can adjust what we do to keep meeting those needs. Nancy, do you have anything to add?
I'm not sure. What was the question again?
The question is around equity in schools and in access to learning. And as schools reopen, are there steps that we can take to ensure that there's equitable access to learning for all students?
From all the discussions that I've heard, both in the state and nationally, that's going to be a huge focus. This is hugely problematic, and you know, transportation alone, as Steve mentioned, is going to be very problematic, and special needs kids are going to need a lot of special attention. What we haven't done yet is pull in the school nurses to see what kind of ideas they have, and the special needs teachers. I also think that if we get to the point where we have rapid testing, accurate rapid testing, that's going to help, and that will be a game changer. We're just not there yet. So until that happens, then schools are just going to have to be as creative as they can be. But it is a focus of all the discussions I've heard.
Benjamin, can I add to this?
Yes.
Our firm has been trying to glean lots of information, as all of us here are, and we've done a bit of a research study reaching out to a number of school districts across the country just to understand COVID impacts, the immediate, what we're anticipating for the fall, what we're anticipating for the future. I think we spoke to 100 interviews, 77 districts, and equity was a huge thing that kept coming up. And the thing that districts were talking about to date certainly was access to technology. That was incredibly revealed. Districts all over the country and here in Washington have done an amazing job of handling needs of students, whether it is technology and access and trying to find means of giving them devices, or Wi-Fi, whether it is food or housing. And so there's been a lot of lessons learned immediately from this summer. There have been a number of partnerships, particularly here in Washington State, particularly with regard to partnerships, using Boys and Girls Club, using health entities, especially as schools were asked to also provide daycare for first responders. I think in addition to recognizing the equities that were always there that people see that they'd like the new paradigms to come and address, some really amazing things began to happen in that there were conversations where teachers spent a lot of the initial time after the pandemic reaching out to students and really trying to understand what they needed. And I spoke with a number of superintendents who spoke about getting paraeducators, for example, for special needs students at home. We haven't solved the inequity issues by any stretch of the imagination, but it would be prudent to take some of this very student-focused thinking that has been happening from the immediate addressing of these issues that districts are doing and looking at how we continue that as we return to schools.
Thanks, Lisa. Is there, Mohammed or Joanne, do you want to add on to that at all?
I can quickly add one other topic that well, Lisa had mentioned, is really looking at it in terms of the technology piece. I know a lot of the areas, depending on where you're at, how do you build the infrastructure that's going to be able to be delivered to different areas of the city, I think has been a pretty big challenge. And I know a lot of the entities in terms of, you know, the providers are looking at working with different organizations to kind of help bring that forward. So there's been a lot of good movement on that. I know from an engineering perspective and from our perspective, what we're starting to explore is, you know, how do you bring that to fruition for some of the local areas, and what are the additional devices and or requirements that is needed to really help boost up, because that's based on, you know, the plan that's been laid out based on, you know, phase 3 and phase 5. It's really going to be that combination of infrastructure that's going to help support them at home versus, you know, the infrastructure that's going to be in the school. So that's some of the topics that we're starting to get more involved in and working with the local entities.
And Ben, I just wanted to add in a couple of elements. I think, you know, there have been some really, on the technology side, some really enheartening stories. I think even just shared from Edmonds in recognizing and transferring the function of a school bus to being hotspots so that the technology can reach those students in neighborhoods that don't have it. I think those kind of stories begin to talk about not only the resilience that the districts have had in getting through this, but also then perhaps the hope in how we can continue to maintain it. And I think I would also want to add that, you know, the AIA document really did take equity and inclusion to heart, and really thinking through some of those places for the districts that will challenge our ability to limit transmission or the exchange of goods or services like food. And the ideas, you know, floated around eating in the classroom don't necessarily address the fact that not everyone has the ability to bring food into that classroom to begin with. And so how do we begin to think about providing occupation for every student, thinking about as well, is there an opportunity to identify for those more sensitive or health fragile students? Are there places with which we can increase the ventilation even more, even if we can't do MERV 13 and 14 everywhere? Are there places in which we can really create opportunities for those students that need it the most? And so just wanting to add in that there's many, many layers to the equity inclusion that I think are so incredibly complex. I know that there are district compatriots that are on the call and others are really taking to heart and moving forward, and excited to see how that might begin to change even day-to-day delivery of education as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good stepping off point for our next question, which is about facilities and how can schools update or adjust their current facilities to ensure that student health, privacy, and dignity are honored and protected from the time a student arrives until they're dismissed at the end of the day. I can assign people if you want me to.
Go for it. This is again a really big topic. I'll just jump in and say, there's also conversations around short-term and long-term implications, and as designers thinking through how to create resilient facilities, not only now but in the future. I think hand washing comes up, and I think Nancy's comment about investing in, sinks and actually celebrating the ritual of hand washing and making it part of the practice and the natural flow of school environments will not only save classroom instruction time, but also begin to kind of think through how we begin to prevent things like this in the future. I would also think about, issues around HEPA, and when we're thinking about screening, what does that look like at the front door? If we are identifying students that may have fevers or not, how do we keep that private? And when we have so many students trying to enter the building at the same time, and trying to think through that process as well. I did see on the chat some suggestions about perhaps home monitoring and notification in advance to kind of limit the screening process, but curious about some of those aspects. I'm going to let some other voices come in here as well and then continue the conversation.
Yeah, I think Joanne, those are some great points. I think the one thing I wanted to just kind of highlight is that not one size fits all. Mm-hmm. I think the biggest driver to this, as Nancy has mentioned in her slide deck, was the dilution factor of ventilation air, introducing ventilation air as much as possible. However, that's a dynamic effect to what the energy requirements are that you might have already laid out for your school. And so that's a give or take scenario where you want to do the right thing and bring in as much air, but then you're also being penalized on the other side with, you have your local entities that are looking at that. So those are the conversations that really need to get started and start looking at. There's also touchless sensor technology. A lot of the controls vendors are starting to implement that. How do you bring that in with a already existing infrastructure? That's a one way of doing it. And then there's the whole topic of discussion of air movement within the space. As students come in, and there's going to be less students, so per se there'll be less of a load in the building, so more air can be introduced. But how do you really inculcate that air distribution is going to be critical within each classroom space. So those are some of the things that that need to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, and along those lines, we know that there's buildings that can do it and there's buildings that can't. I mean, I still deal with schools that don't even have a ventilation system. They rely on the windows. Those are going to be hugely problematic. I think what we're going to have to see is more work with your local health jurisdictions. The guidance from OSPI says you do have to work with them. How much COVID is circulating in communities is going to be a factor. How much you can, deal with if you have a variety of buildings with a variety of options with ventilation. We also are preparing for wildfire smoke season. And that is traditionally hugely problematic for schools, but COVID makes it even worse. But I wanted to mention on the health screenings, there has not been enough discussion yet on that, I don't think, to really know how that's going to happen. have met a couple times with the school nurse administrators, and they've been discussing it. The temperature checks with the infrared thermometers are very popular. They're also very inaccurate, particularly outside. They're almost worthless outside as far as I'm concerned because they're taking temperature of the skin. And only 50% of people have fevers, and usually you're well into the disease before you even have a fever. So it's not a particularly good indicator. It's just one that's captured people's attention because they're doing it in other places on the news. I think we're going to have to educate parents and provide options for sick kids. That is just huge because we have so many parents, and that's an equity issue, who don't have options when their kids are sick. And so if they're mildly ill, they end up back at school. And there's a lot of people that are mildly ill, thank heavens, because we have way too many people really seriously ill with this. This is a really nasty virus. So that's a piece of it too. And then school districts are also dealing with the issue of staff that are at higher risk, right, and how they're going to deal with that.
Well, and I think one of the big keys for every district is going to have being able to have a deep understanding of their buildings. There's not equity across the district generally in our buildings. We have buildings that have great capabilities on the HVAC ventilation side, and buildings that have none. And that can vary in the same district. And just the same thing, the features of the building and the spaces that are in the building are not necessarily equitable. So a deep understanding of your buildings and looking and breaking down the proposed student day for the different flows of activity it's going to look different in some respects from building to building. So for the nurses space, and a space that's going to hold kids potentially have COVID versus the kids that have, a skinned up knee, knocked my head on the counter, or lost a tooth, whatever, the regular things, you've got to separate those. There's HVAC implications. I mean, I just think it's an opportunity for districts to put some importance on a workshop, even scenario in their district, to look at the buildings, assess the space needs and the space capabilities on how they can respond, because every building is going to respond differently in this situation.
One thing for me to add to this is all really good and relevant, and all of this information changes daily, and I appreciate the experience and the expertise of the panel and our variety of hats we wear. I struggle with and wonder, how do we provide these measures while also continuing to provide learning environments that support the type of learning that we thought about pre-COVID? If our goal is to return to face-to-face learning and peer-to-peer, or even to create safe environments, you're returning, you're coming back to a human connection, you're coming back to a community. How do we do that? And what's the balance? And it will be a bit of a logistical game. It is a capacity thing on one hand, transportation on the other, and then there's flow, and there's figuring it out. And I have heard schools of thought where, get everybody in the classroom and they stay there, or they're in a small cohort, particular for elementary, and they stay together. But if we take what we just discussed from an equity perspective, and we said, we want to take that vibe of, okay, this is crazy, we're all in this together, we want to be about you, student. How could we flip that? Yes, we still have to do these, but maybe you come to a health screening, and it's also where you're able to check in with your mental health professional, or maybe you're checking in on tutoring, or my computer doesn't work, or whatever it is. Maybe there's ways, again, these are great guidelines, but we've been developing campuses and buildings that we've wanted the whole building or the whole campus to be used for a long time now. Maybe this is a chance to test it. Maybe thinking about outdoor areas. Again, not huge groups, everyone's avoiding that. But again, on one hand, we're trying to separate students, but on the other hand, we're trying to bring back collaborative learning or maybe experiential learning. And so it's going to be a balance. Nancy, not to put you on the spot, but to even ask about, what's the balance between isolation versus the need for movement, and health. I don't know if any of those conversations are going on.
They are. I mean, it's a huge issue. This, there really was pandemic planning that did include this type of isolation. It started over 10 years ago, but I've talked with people who really never thought we would see this. And we know there's just huge mental health issues. And if you think of, I've been involved with education reform for 25 years or more, and this just throws everything we've been doing with collaboration up, upside down. So we're going to have to, until we get that vaccine, which let's just cross our fingers that we get it sooner rather than later and that it's actually effective. We're just going to have more respiratory droplet control. So I don't know if we're answering all the chat questions. The cloth face coverings really do help contain respiratory droplets. So we may find that actually does help. I've been skeptical that we can really keep kids 6 feet away all day long in schools. And in addition to which, if you picture your 6-foot bubbles, kids cannot just sit at the desk.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm getting antsy sitting here after an hour, and I have a sit stand at home, so I may be standing up pretty soon. So their bubbles intersect. That's one reason for the increased ventilation, the cloth face coverings. But we also have this side conversation going on about will we be able to keep cloth face coverings on kids? How creative can we be? Will they need at least 2 to get through the day because they get wet? Yes, you do get enough oxygen through them. I don't know where those strange ideas are coming from. And they don't increase the CO2, the cloth face ones. I mean, that would be negligible. Well, the N95s do to some extent. And then there's the face shields. Those are mentioned in the OSPI guide. There are some health officers who aren't real thrilled with that idea, but I talk to people in education who think those would, maybe it's not quite as good as a cloth face covering, but it's better than nothing, and at least you can see the face and see the facial expressions. So I think we're still learning about much of this. On part of the reason for getting the guide out, I felt I wasn't part of those decisions or anything, was so people could start planning. But within my own agency, we've been told that some of our guidance could be modified as we learn more. I mean, just think in 4 months how much more we've learned about this virus and its transmission. Somebody mentioned in the chat the Wall Street Journal article today, which was pretty good.
I do think the intersection of both the conversation that Lisa and Nancy have been having is really this dialogue between talking about fixing the casters on all of the mobile furniture that we have now in schools is heartbreaking. Thinking about the psychology of safety implications of putting kids behind dividers in a cafeteria environment and the emulation of prison. I mean, there are so many places where this intersection of the physical environment and our children and needing that sense of safety, security, kind of the whole child aspect are really in collision in this place where we also are trying to protect their health long-term, their physical health. We also need to be thinking about their mental health. And so I am very interested in thinking, or very curious to see how, when districts begin to work with guidelines and put into practice, because it is a conversation between the building and operations, right? It is definitely a dialogue between both functions and, of course, curriculum, thinking about learning outcomes. What is the right mix, and where can we really find learning outcomes that maybe are equal, but also maybe better? Our goal should maybe thinking about learning outcomes that are better, perhaps, than the places where we think that we have been in the past. So don't have answers, but again, to kind of rephrase the earlier piece, just it's living in that question and being able to share openly with each other as through A4LE and other venues, what we're all thinking and doing that hopefully will begin to sort of open up this dialogue even more.
Yeah, and I think I think looking at that balance between health and safety and student engagement leads us really well into our next and final question for the panel, which is, how can school facilities limit exposure to students and staff from high-risk transmission activities like passing periods, music programs, PE, dining, all the things that kids do that are outside of their classroom that makes school actually fun?
You know, if you look at that guide, it's not really informative yet. I was involved with one conversation about choir, and we all know the choir is hugely problematic. It's probably the most problematic of any of the activities. I don't know, there's some things we may have to just not do for a while. The cafeterias, they're already talking about eating in the school, in the classrooms. And, you know, I started this job in 2003 after all the indoor air quality work in our state starting in the 1990s, trying to get kids out of the classrooms for eating. So we didn't have all that food and junk on the floors and in the mold and the pests. So, you know, another thing is, and maybe Marina was going to pop in on this, is we need more custodial help to get through this. We really do.
Yeah.
I'm not willing to shut down drinking fountains because a school doesn't want to have to clean and sanitize them. Although I'm trying to get more information on that issue. But this is tough.
It is, I think, but the important things are in Nancy's presentations, it's very clear, and the evidence and scientific evidence supports it. We need to adjust some of our expectations in thinking that if we have something running around and sanitizing everything right after it's touched, that's going to somehow solve the problem. That, I think, is something that needs to be adjusted as an understanding about what this is going to look like, and having a great deal of, not sure of the word, if it's grace or what, in working through the issues with your custodial staff on expectations. You know, traditionally we are staffed custodial wise based on, you know, the prototypical model, looking at square footage and student count and things like that. And most departments are probably understaffed. I know ours is. And so anytime you look to add something new to a custodian's role, you're taking away from another piece that's very important also. There's something that's not going to get done to get this other task done. So it's going to be a big challenge. There was a comment in the chat that I thought was really interesting about thinking about recess and play, because I've thought about that. Our district participates and does PlayWorks, which is a very intentional curriculum for recess. And I think that whatever we do all through the student day, it's going to require more attention, more thoughtfulness, more intention on guiding kids through the day. And that includes recess and how that looks, because we can't just say that we can just turn kids loose on the playground and not expect their bubbles to pop when they're out there interacting.
Yeah, I think one of the things I was just going to add is part of that recess, it goes actually beyond that. I think it's that interaction between, you know, students, or that competitiveness. There's a lot of key element to that for a lot of kids, not everyone, but it also for a lot of kids. That's one of the things I was thinking psychologically, you know, how that's affecting some of the kids, that element is being removed. It's you can have children exercise, or you can be part of that exercise, but I can't keep up with my 14-year-old son. Obviously he'll exercise me, but it's still a very critical element of their learning process. It'd be interesting to just kind of know that more psychologically. Maybe Nancy, you have a little more thought on that, and in terms of how that's being.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a big part of everything that's going on. This is not a normal environment for adults, let alone for kids. So I think that at every level, we have to be thinking about how we can provide more opportunity for kids. I do want to follow up on what Marina said. I am really fighting and hoping that people do not do what they were doing before the closure and closing the schools and thinking they had to disinfect everything. That is not effective, and it's dangerous, and it's a waste of chemicals. And I've said for years, you just cannot assume that any surface you touch is sterile. It's not going to be. We need to continue to emphasize the hand washing, and don't take this and touch this when you're out in public. I learned that from a pediatrician through this. I think it's a great way to teach. Sure, we can wipe down surfaces occasionally, but you're not going to keep them disinfected. You're also probably not generally picking up enough viral load unless somebody's coughing, sneezing, vomiting. Those are times when we do extra cleaning, extra disinfection. I keep saying, you know, vomit, feces, urine, and blood. And then, you know, I suppose if somebody starts having a huge sneezing attack, we might have to include that. Although soap and water, if you clean adequately, would be enough.
Well, and in one thing, you know, in every forum that I seem to be in, I keep on reiterating this, that our custodians and our custodial staff have been doing this for years. We've had schools that have had norovirus, that have had other, you know, infectious diseases, that we have worked with our local health departments. We have worked with Department of Health if necessary, but we've all learned from Nancy over the years, and our staff is very well trained on how to respond to these kinds of things. So we're not necessarily reinventing the wheel here. We're going to use the procedures and the practices that we've been perfecting for years, and use the right products and the right application with the right PPE and the right ventilation to take care of these spaces. I feel comfortable myself saying that when it comes to cleaning schools, that's our wheelhouse, and we've got that. We've got that. The harder job is how to figure out how to teach kids in a situation where we're expecting to social distance and, you know, put some major.
It's that respiratory droplet transmission, which is our primary issue, coupled with so much asymptomatic carrier. So they can do all the health screenings they want. I still think that's of limited value, because what we're really dealing with in the public environment is that pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic transmissions, which is why we're trying to control respiratory droplets. Someone asked about schools with a confirmed case. So CDC has specific guidance. Right now, it's still saying closed for 2 to 5 days. I honestly do not expect that to stand or to be reasonable, but I think it's still going to be discussed with your local health. At the point when that was coming out, it was an issue of a lot of unknowns. Part of it's going to be how well there's contact tracing at the local level. That's going to be a huge part of this. And then because we know the virus can stay in the air for some period of time, that's why we want that more ventilation. I was telling somebody right now, you know, more important than disinfecting is to blow that place out. That's going to be, I think, more useful than trying to disinfect things that have fallen onto surfaces. But that will be a part of it if you have had somebody who's a known positive, is there will be more disinfectant. But of the surfaces where people are going to pick up possibly the virus, not the floors, not necessarily the furniture, although this is a good reason to get rid of that soft furniture we've been trying to get rid of for years, you know. This virus is not going to jump off of surfaces. It's not a flea. You have to actually pick it up and then touch your face, besides what is still floating in the air.
I think there's a lot of room for clarification in the guidance as it's been issued. One of the pieces, talking about screening, it mentioned employee screening. And I don't know that there's been very much conversation about that, but certainly I think that there's room for clarification when you mention contact tracing. So if we are screening staff as they enter the building, is that for the purpose of contact tracing? Who keeps those documents? Where are they reported to? I mean, there's a lot of questions out there that are just on a practical basis.
I hadn't thought about that. I mean, most of that screening is because they think sick people are trying to come to work.
Sure.
I keep thinking that in this environment, if sick people are trying to come to work, we really haven't been educating very well.
Right.
Another thought on this question, I mean, obviously there's so much of this that's being developed and so much underway, and the districts certainly are thinking through a lot of these logistical things. So with regard to today's exercise, or just for a call to action for planners and architects, of which we have many, I wonder whether, obviously Nancy's giving us guidance health-wise, music and other things, and larger groups aren't permitted, but I think in addition to the groupings that we've looked at, the 6-foot spacing, the one-way directions of circulation, all of these other things, I feel like there's some reverse engineering of scenarios of how learning environments can be converted to just provide whatever, different groupings, different relationships. Outdoors, this might be one venue for play that's not quite resourced, that's something else. I don't know that we're going to have the luxury of having this perfect plan and then going, great, tell me your perfect plan and we'll program it out for you. But we know we have facilities and we know what they were intended to do originally, and we are hearing and listening to these concerns and basically the recipe. So how do we, in our thinking, in our leadership, with what we're trying to do here today and moving forward, how do we maybe capture some of the things that we think regarding use of outdoor space, or how a play or a brain break could happen in a classroom? Or, I actually have a personal philosophy that if anyone goes through the phase 5, where some schools are open and some not, it could be likely that early learning kids go to high schools, right, in that scenario, and that the secondary kids are the ones who stay at home. So there's some adapting high school environments to early learning. I think if that happens, maybe the high schoolers should come, not fully, because that's the numbers we're trying to avoid, but a couple high school kids here and there. Yes, I'm trying to get my teenager out of the house, but maybe they could be mentors for some of this extra staff or extra whatever. I feel like there's some creative things that we could work on regarding planning and space. Again, we'd have to test the health implications for much of this thought, but I feel like it's a start. I feel like all these simultaneous thoughts are going to need to converge, and we just need a scenario plan.
I was just going to say one thing. Nancy, there was a question about what to do if a school does find a confirmed case within a school, and then this was with regards to cleaning.
That's what I said about the two. Right now, CDC is still recommending a 2 to 5 day closure, and I don't think that's going to still be the recommendation once school starts, because I don't think it's going to be practical. But I don't know. I mean, we have guidance for enhanced cleaning and disinfecting, but I don't think we've worked out what we'll actually do in terms of, does the school close? I think that's hugely problematic. So I'm still bringing that issue up in my meetings to have a discussion. Can you hear me? I had sound problems for a minute.
Okay, yes, thank you. Okay, Ben.
The other thing, I just want, somebody said perfect, I think it was Lisa. one of my points, I had those 7 principles for how how you stop transmission. But one of the issues that people have to recognize as we reopen is you cannot guarantee no transmission. So it's a risk assessment. And that has to be part of the local decisions with your local health department, because there is no guarantee that there won't be some transmission. We're trying to reduce it. We can't, the only way to eliminate it is if we all stayed in our own little bubbles.
Yeah. Well, and I love the ideas about repurposing spaces and things like that. I know in our department, we count how many calendar days between the end of school, the start of school, and there's a lot of things to happen in that short amount of time. Last year we had 47 days and it felt like it went like that. So when it comes to repurposing spaces and setting up classrooms for a future state to open in September, we're already behind, is what I feel. I mean, planning wise, we're already behind. And so we have to keep our expectations on something that's accomplishable. And that's going to be key, affordable and accomplishable with the staff that we have and the resources that we have right now.
Well, I think that's a good transition point to move into small groups. So I invite all of the participants to go ahead and turn your cameras back on. Unmute yourself at this point. We are going to have Donna with A4LE send everybody out into rooms of about 9 people each. I've got a new screen up on Menti, so you can still use your phone, connect back to Menti and use the same number, that 845640 code. And we're going to ask that during your discussions, when you're spread out in rooms, to please share your thoughts, the conversations that you're having in a sentence or two. And then when we get back, those can be rolling on the screen and we'll try and have a little bit of a conversation. Hopefully we can have a tenable conversation with this many people. We'll see how it works, but here we go. Let's see, Donna, you can go ahead and send us out into rooms if you're able. All right. I want to welcome everybody back. I hope the small group discussions were useful. I've just shared my screen. So these are the discussion points that had been recorded. If your group talked about anything that you don't see up here and that you haven't had a chance to record, I'm going to leave this open for another minute or two. And then we are going to move into hopefully a little bit of a share back for maybe 10 minutes. If you would like to discuss what you talked about with your group, and maybe let some people hear your thoughts behind it. I'm going to open my participant tab, and I think that there should be a way to raise your hand. I'm hoping. So that we don't have everybody talk at once, but I don't see that. So I am just going to say, if you would like to talk a little bit about what your group discussed, just go ahead and unmute yourself and start talking, and hopefully it won't be bedlam. And if nobody wants to talk, I'll give everybody a few more seconds and then we'll just move on to the next slide.
Hey Ben, this is Liz. I think our group had a really great discussion about equity, and then the kind of talk that I guess the international board had a few hours ago on logistics, like in what everybody else is doing around the world versus having the opportunity to change and relook at our educational models and see if we can make an overhaul.
Awesome. I think that's going to be a really big issue for schools function. Let's see, I'm going to open the chat and see if there's anybody that's trying to use that.
Hey, Ben, Melissa English. I can give an update on what our group talked about.
Great.
So one thing we discussed, several of us in the group were also parents dealing with the work from home and be your child's teacher. Some things we've heard feedback from educators is that they didn't have training on how to do, virtual teaching. So, talking to OSPI about funding for additional training for the educators. We discussed, the challenge of developing connections between teachers and students when they are moving into a new classroom and they aren't going to have that relationship. So we talked about, kind of the struggles with the virtual learning environment. Maybe those Zoom or Teams calls are for one-on-ones between student and teacher after they've built some connections in person in the classroom. We also discussed how the equity, or more like the inequity, of the HVAC systems throughout various schools. Some are not designed to bring in outside air. So how do you deal with that, in addition to, different humidity across the, different districts, what the weather's like, all of those types of things. Then we got into a little bit of kind of rethinking what a classroom looks like. And there are studies that show that outdoor learning has better results for students. So really kind of trying to rethink what is a classroom, what is a learning environment for a child. So those are the things that we got into in our group.
Thank you. unless there is anyone. There's
Ben,
anyone else.
and you're
I'm
breaking up pretty badly. Yeah, I'm not sure
Yeah.
if anyone heard the question.
Yeah, I'll let anybody else speak who is interested. Not, we're gonna have one final question from next year. It's around a follow-up meeting. If people feel like they would like to continue discussion.
So I'm just going to jump in. So Ben was breaking up there. I don't know that I'm breaking up too, but the question is really, would you like to have another follow-up meeting? And if so, this would be a meeting that we'd have in July. So I guess I would still be president, or yes, I'm still president because I'm handing the gavel in August. So anyway, there you go. And I'm not going to vote. I'll let everyone else vote.
It looks like the response is a resounding yes.
Yes, so
Yeah, seems like it.
We'll set to work. And one thing that we would like to have on our panel for next time is we would like to include a student. If you know of a student who has participated in design discussions before, I'm really fascinated with the question of where and how have the students been learning at home? Where is their favorite place to learn? And can we learn from those places and then, in a sense, replicate it in our new vision of what a classroom looks like? So that's sort of my question.
I don't know if I'm still breaking up or not. Hopefully I'm not, but I think that's a good question, Tane. And if anybody else has any questions before we close, that they would like to address on the next session would be actually really helpful for us in our planning. So take a few seconds and answer that. We would appreciate it.
Nobody's hearing you.
I think we might have actually, oh, there's Ben. Ben, can you try speaking?
I'll give it a try. Let me know if I'm breaking up still.
You know, Ben, what's happening is it's clear for about 10 seconds or so, and then it starts to break up. So not sure if that'll help, that information will help or not.
I'll be briefer.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure how much longer we're collecting questions, but if you have more, go ahead. And I don't know, Ben, how much longer will the Mentimeter be active?
Let me take a look. I can leave it active for another 4 or 5 minutes after we close this down, and then I'll shut it.
Okay. And then just so you know, we will be sharing our slide deck with everybody. There is a slide at the back that has references to some of the links that Nancy Bernard mentioned, also Joanna Wilcox. And so, and then of course, the OSPI documents. So we want to make research available for everybody. And then definitely we do want to continue this discussion and get to design solutions that will help all school districts. So thank you all for participating. Ben, do you want to?
Yeah, if my speaker's working, I just want to thank everybody again. And
okay, thank you.
bye.
Bye.